acclaimed, got it, renowned and acclaimed Blue Badge tourist guide in London. I'm sure, like everyone who has joined this evening, we are really excited by the title, Tales of the Tube. So belt up and let us enjoy the ride.
Thank you, Rifat. Thank you very much. Very kind. Now, can you see my screen, everybody? There's Tales of the Tube on it. Good. I'm getting a few nods, so I hope that's going to be okay. Now, this is, as it says on the screen, a quirky look at the London Underground. And I think the picture that I'm showing you is itself pretty quirky, because it's part of an advertisement to use the tube to go to the Tate Gallery. And on the tube of paint, it says Pimlico, which of course is one of the stations that you would use to get there. And then the iconic tube map is outlined in paint trails. So that, to me, is the essence of what I find quirky and interesting. So let's make a start. If I can actually get there. So this is my first picture, and you're probably thinking, my goodness me, what has this got to do with the tube, which is, after all, underground? But the story goes back a long way, and it really starts with the congestion on the River Thames. With the Industrial Revolution and the empire, trade and commerce was enormous, and London was a vast hub of such activity. And of course, when you had all this going on the river, it was very, very difficult for people to get across it. And so Mark Brunel, the father of the famous Isambard, he had this great plan that he would be the engineer who would construct a tunnel under the Thames, and that would bypass all the traffic congestion. So he started to think about how he might do it. But one of the difficulties with tunneling is, of course, keeping the earth, A, stable, and B, finding somewhere to put it, like those prisoners in the famous war film, where they were digging a tunnel, but they had to fill their pockets with the spoil because they didn't know where to put the soil they were digging out. This was a problem, and we'll come back to that later on. So he decided he'd start to think about how to dig a tunnel. But the problem of the actual tunnel collapsing, with millions of tons of the Thames water incoming, was something that occupied his mind very seriously. And then he had what we might call a eureka moment. He saw, beavering away in a piece of wood, the dreaded shipworm, Teredo nivalis. Now, this was the shipworm which munched its way through the woodwork of the wooden ships of that time. And the only way that people could stop this happening to their ships was by coating the bottom of their ships with copper, which is where we get the expression that if something is safe, it's a copper-bottomed issue. But while he was watching this activity, he noticed that the Teredo nivalis was doing something quite interesting. As it burrowed, it was forming a tube which hardened around the burrow. So where the worm had been did not fall in and crush it. And this was his eureka moment. And from that experience, he developed his amazing Thames Tunnelling Shield. And this is what it looked like. Basically, you have a group of men who are burrowing away. They are the people here on the right-hand side of the picture, and they are organizing removal of the soil in front of them. The soil is being taken back, and men behind are building a brick tube to support where the tunneling has been going on. It was revolutionary. It wasn't foolproof. There were moments when, you know, there were tunnel break-ins and 6 people lost their lives, but basically it solved the problem. And here we've got a very good photograph of tunneling going on. Again, in the 19th century, Brunel was doing his tunnel in the 1840s. This is a little bit later, but you can see the same principle. Men digging, and as they tunnel forwards, brick surrounds are made to keep the tunnel safe behind them as they move on. And here, of course, this is the amazing thing. They are still using the same system. This is a picture which I've captured for you of the work that's being done on HS2 and Crossrail, moving a little faster than Brunel's tunnel, I would think, at 15 meters a day, but it is still the same principle. And this was the same principle which dug the tunnel under the channel. And in fact, I can remember as a tour guide coming back from Folkestone with a coachload of French visitors. And at that time, at the side of the road as you departed from Folkestone, there was the tunnel boring device, which had a big sign on it saying, "For sale, one careful owner." Now, it's the kind of thing like this that reminds us of how Sir Isaac Newton said, "We can see far because we are standing on the shoulders of giants." And the HS2 and Crossrail engineers are standing on the shoulders of Brunel. And here is a commemorative picture of the tunnel, which of course originally was only intended for people to walk through, or perhaps come through in their coach with their horses, or ride their horse through. And that tunnel is still there. It's still being used. It's part of our underground system from Rotherhithe to Wapping. And here we can see somebody had the grand idea of taking trains through this tunnel under the river. And I want you to notice most particularly that they are being pulled by steam locomotives. Now, there was no ventilation at that time. The steam and the smoke and everything used to make traveling on these trains unbearable. The carriages originally had no windows, and so they had to be lit, and they were lit by gas, which was carried in huge canvas bags on the roof of the carriages. So you can imagine what a dangerous business it was. So keep in mind that ventilation problem. We're going to come back to it a little bit later on. And here we can see the situation not with the Thames, but above ground in the City of London. We think we have difficulties with congestion in the City of London, but my goodness me, we really haven't. Look at this. This is absolute gridlock with all these horse-drawn coaches, hansom cabs, horse-drawn omnibuses. It was truly a huge problem. And they decided that the answer might be to do what they'd done under the river to help traffic flow, and to do the same under the city by digging tunnels and sending trains through. But of course, everywhere was already covered with buildings and roads. And the system they used at the beginning was called cut and cover. And so what they would do, they would take an existing roadway, because they could do that. They couldn't actually knock down people's houses and shops, but they could take the road surface up, burrow down, make their tunnel, build the brick skin to keep it upright, and then recover and allow the road to continue. The amount of congestion and problems this must have caused must have been an absolute nightmare. And of course, all done by hand with a few horses and occasional steam cranes. Here's another picture of the kind of chaos that's going on. On the sides of the roads, of course, we've got the poor inhabitants who go about their shopping and so on, and the big stores road going away in the middle of the road. And I must say, I don't think those things shoring the pavement look terribly safe for me. And this is a kind of idea that you get of how close to the surface those early railway lines actually were. Very, very close indeed. And in fact, I, for a while, lived in a basement flat in Mayfair. And certainly I was very aware with the vibrations and so on when the underground trains went through. It was really quite hairy till you got used to it. But you can see very close to the surface. Now we come back to what I spoke to you about a few moments ago, the problem of ventilation, because originally the trains that they were pushing under these cut and cover tunnels were still being pulled by steam locos. Now look closely at these houses, the ones on the right and the ones on the left, they have curtains. The two in the middle don't seem to have curtains, and their front doors don't seem to have any letterbox or anything like that. This is Leinster Gardens, which is very close to Paddington Station. And in order not to spoil the frontage of Leinster Gardens, this is what they did. They cut out the back. And here we've got the original ventilation system. The trains would come through here and the actual tunnels would be ventilated. And you can see these huge steel girders are holding the sides of this ventilation area apart. And in the middle at the back, you can see the back of those houses in Leinster Gardens. And you can imagine, can't you, sending rookie postmen as a sort of trick, as a way to make fun of them and say, deliver to number whatever it is, Leinster Gardens, and they would arrive there and there would be no letterbox and they'd be really, really perplexed. So if you're ever in that area, you look out for those two houses without curtains or letterboxes, and you're looking at these ventilation houses. Now, we've been talking about the network running underground, but in fact, only about 45% of the network is underground. And this map shows you roughly where it is, and you can get an idea, because as London began to spill out around the edges and people went into John Betjeman's Metro land, for instance, and new housing estates were being built, and the underground made it possible for these people to live in the countryside, breathe clean air, but commute swiftly and efficiently into London on the tube. And of course, this is what's been happening since COVID. We've noticed that people are trying to get out of cities and into the countryside because of the need to get away from the infection, if you like. So that's the underground area in the dark grey. All around are areas where the underground is overground. And here, for instance, this is the Dollisbourne Viaduct, and it's actually 60 feet above ground, carrying the underground trains on the Northern Line. And I think it's typical of this sort of Victorian brickwork, which is so beautifully made and is so robust and still is doing it all these years later. But how did you get about on the London Underground? It was quite confusing because above ground you can look out for reference points. But once you're underground, you are at the mercy of the darkness. You don't know where the dickens you are. And the first underground maps tried to reflect what was above ground, followed the lines of the roads and so on, tried to indicate greater or smaller distances between the various stops. But it wasn't really very helpful. And this was the kind of thing which was started to help visitors traveling right back in the 1860s when the first underground trains ran. And it wasn't until the 1930s that a man called Harry Beck, who was actually an electrical engineer, had an idea of how to rationalize the map. Now, remember, he was an electrical engineer. So what did he do? He designed the map as a circuit diagram, such as you would use for a complicated piece of electrical machinery. And this is the first version of his map. And the London Underground were very skeptical. No, this will never catch on. And so they made several thousand copies, which, as you see at the top left of the picture, were issued free. Every single copy was snatched up by travelers and was used with great joy and relief. And London Underground realized that this was something that was going to catch on. And that since then, the London Underground map has been in this format. But not only has it been the London Underground, but I know many, many people of you here tonight have been all over the world, and you will have seen many, many cities throughout the world have been using their own version of the map for their city, but in the same sort of format. And it was very, very interesting because the person who finally gave permission for it to be used was a chap called Frank Pick. And Frank Pick's job was to try and rationalize everything to do with the London Underground. And one of the big things that he did, I mustn't miss this out. Looking at the underground map, a lot of people have a lot of fun using the lines and the stations to draw animals. So there's a whole website that you can go on where you can see these animals, which you can find by following lines and drawing on the tube map. Now, this was one of Frank Pick's most important innovations. He chose this man that you see on the left at the top of the picture, Edward Johnston, who was a calligrapher. He was really, really competent, taught Eric Gill, among others, who is famous for his scripts and so on, and fonts. And he was very, very much interested in the Roman style of writing on monuments in the stonework. And he used this to do what Frank Pick had asked him to do, form a font which could be used on the London Underground everywhere and would be completely unambiguous and could be used to spell everything and to give instructions and make the whole thing much more homogeneous and a unit. And he also got him to work on the famous logo, the circle with the bar across. Now, at Farringdon Station, there is a memorial to Edward Johnston. And if you look very carefully at this, it is printed in mirror writing, because of course, that is how you print. If you want it to be printed, then you have to set it up back to front. But if you go along the alphabet from right to left, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and then his name is spelt Johnston, and then it goes on KLMN. Very, very clever. And I'm sure that he was probably looking down when this was unveiled. I think it was 2018. And thinking how marvelous that he would be commemorated in this way. It's a very great salute to a very great calligrapher. Now, we all know, we've heard it so many times, that in London, once the Blitzkrieg, the German bombing of London, really became a serious issue at the beginning of the war, Londoners flocked to the tube stations to spend the night in relative safety, because they were pretty deep underground by now. So we're looking at the 1940s. Here you've got the Aldwych, you've got people sleeping on the platforms, people sleeping beneath the lines, and they're standing on the platform, making sure that nothing awful happens. There is an air raid warden, and behind him is another warden who is, I'm not sure quite what, and the man in the brown suit just looks as if he's there to boss people about. But this was something that was happening all over London. But on the 3rd of March, 1943, something dreadful happened. Bethnal Green in the East End of London, their tube station hadn't been completed. The trains weren't running yet, but the station was being used as an air raid shelter. Now, for 3 years, remember, 1943 this is, for 3 years, the local council had been lobbying the government to make the stairwell down into the station safer. They wanted a central dividing rail. They wanted handrails at the sides, and the government refused. So at 8:30 on the 3rd of March, it was pitch dark, and an air raid warning sounded. And the people of Bethnal Green began hurrying towards the station. Then they heard an enormous series of explosions. Now, this was a sound they'd not heard before, and they assumed that it was one more devilish bomb that the Germans were sending against the citizens of London. And they began to hurry, not panic, but to hurry. And unfortunately, one lady carrying her baby fell as she got to the bottom of the steps. They were dark, they were slippery. Not realizing what was happening, people kept coming down. They too fell down. And in the end, 173 people were crushed to death because of that dangerous entrance stairway. And this is a memorial to those people, unveiled in 2017, and it's called Stairway to Heaven. And at the top, you can see there is an inverted staircase, a memorial to the staircase that caused the problem. And every single person who was killed, their name is on this memorial. And every year since it's happened, on the 3rd of March, the local people and some of the survivors of the awful time have held a memorial service here to remember those people who died. Of course, at the time, the government did not want this publicized. It could be used as propaganda by the enemy. And they hushed it all up. But I have to tell you that the next day, they were putting into place the exact things that the local council had been asking for 3 years to have instated in the underground station. You can see the central dividing rail, you can see the handrails at the side. One more tragic example of how it takes a serious accident before anything gets done. This is a little bit more cheerful. A big section of the eastern part of the underground between Wanstead, Redbridge and Gants Hill had not yet been fully completed, and it was used as a factory during the war by this company that you can see bottom right, Plessey. They were electronics. And these ladies, mostly ladies, although there are a couple of chaps further back, probably in a supervisory capacity, these ladies are busy making electronic items for the war effort. And there are standing on the left, a bit further back in the picture, you can see there are 2 nurses, because the conditions were pretty ghastly, and I expect quite a few people were overcome by fumes, fainted, perhaps hurt themselves, and the nurses were there to make sure that they were looked after when they had such an accident. But it was very deep and very safe, and the Germans never discovered that it was there. Now, you might be wondering, when you visit the tube, about Mind the Gap. Now, Mind the Gap is important because, of course, each of the carriages is a straight metal tube. But because of that cut and cover method that I told you about before, certainly in the centre of London, a lot of the tube lines had to follow the curving medieval street patterns up above ground. And so what you get on a lot of stations, this one is Bank, what you get on a lot of stations is a straight train coming to rest beside a curved platform. And so you have to be told to mind the gap, because it would be very easy just to step out and slip down the gap. Now, there were some stations which never got built. You know that expression, he who fails to plan, plans to fail. Well, there was a big panjandrum involved with the underground called Charles Yerkes. He was American. And he saw what was happening with the London Underground pushing out into the green fields. And so he bought quite a lot of land in the Hampstead area and a bit further north. And he speculated that if they got the underground trains out there, that land would be full of wonderful new housing, and he'd make an absolute fortune. Well, he made a terrible miscalculation, and 1 or 2 train stations were planned, but they were never completed. They were taken over by other companies. And this one at North End has had a very interesting history, because it was used during the Cold War between the Western Allies and the Soviet bloc. And down here, there were all sorts of controls and things, and a bit like the Cabinet War Rooms, residences and so on, where governments could come and could be kept safe while central London was being bombed or possibly even invaded. Who knows? But these sort of installations are still down there. They're just not open to the public. You can't go and see them because they're probably quite dangerous. But another important thing that was happening down here was that the controls for all the floodgates on the underground could be operated from here. Now, you probably never thought about this, but with all those underground tunnels, it would just take some major explosion involving the Thames, and the results could be pretty horrifying. And all over the London Underground, you probably won't notice them, but pinned back against the wall, there are huge metal floodgates, which, please God, will never have to be used. But while we're on the subject of flooding, I wonder how many of you have taken the tube at Sloane Square. Perhaps you've been doing a bit of shopping at Peter Jones, who knows? And have you ever looked up? Because here, what on earth is this green thing? Well, it's a 19th century, 1860s, metal box which carries the River Westbourne over the tube station. And that had to be done because the engineers at the time could not think of a feasible way to do anything else. So they built this great big steel pipe which goes over the platforms, and it's still there. You can see it. It's still there, and it's still apparently watertight. Thank goodness, because again, there could be need of the floodgates if that were ever to pop its rivets. Okay, you probably think now, oh crumbs, why has she gone on to football? Well, this is one of the kind of posters that what one would see to advertise how useful the underground is. This one was dated 1927. You can see the 27 in the top right-hand corner of the picture. And this is talking about the cup final at Wembley. Bit more about football. This is Stamford Bridge, which is Chelsea's home station. A chap called Mears wanted to have a railway station, a football club of his own, and he founded the Chelsea Football Club, but he needed a stadium. And he found a designer called Leach, and they decided that what they would have would be a stadium with enormous raked banks for people on three sides and just one side with seating and covered seating for the important people, obviously. Well, where were they going to get the soil? Do you remember I told you about the prisoners of war distributing the soil from their tunneling through the pockets, the holes in their pockets, because it was difficult to get rid of the spoil? Well, close by, the Piccadilly line was being built. And so a very, very convenient arrangement was made between the people building the Piccadilly line and Mr. Mears and Mr. Leach, who bought the spoil and formed the Stamford Bridge Stadium. It's been refurbished since then, but basically that's what this is. This is an enormous football stadium, which is actually produced from the spoil of digging the Piccadilly line. And here, I love this picture. This is Ron Greenwood, who was the manager of West Ham. Ron Greenwood is there in the corner, slightly balding, and he's got something on his lap, something wrapped up. What can it be? Well, he's on his way home from the 1963 FA Cup final when West Ham won the FA Cup. And what he's got on his lap is the FA Cup just thrown under a piece of blanket or something. And you think, my goodness, All those other people sitting on the train have got no idea what they have in the carriage with them. But my goodness, you couldn't do that nowadays. You'd never get away with it. One of the things which was a huge innovation for the London Underground, apart from electrifying it, which helped with the ventilation system, was the introduction of escalators. Very new, very American, very frightening, especially when ladies were wearing long skirts. The first escalators on the Underground were introduced in 1911 in Earl, and people were frightened to use them. And so they had this brilliant idea. There was a gentleman called Mr. Harris, nicknamed Bumper, and he'd lost a leg in I think it must have been the Boer War. And so Bumper Harris, there's his stick, there's his watch, they are in the Underground Museum in Covent Garden. He was employed to go up and down all day on the Underground, a one-legged man with a stick, to show people that escalators were not frightening. And of course, it worked. And escalators were introduced all over the place, including, of course, big shops like Harrods and Selfridges. He is a real person. Now, you will hear people say that is an apocryphal story, but I happen to be the friend of someone who is related to him. I think she said she lives in Christchurch Road here in Winchester, and I think she said that he was her great uncle, something like that. So he really is a real person. Don't believe it if people you say to you that was made up. It wasn't. Now, of course, another thing which was a great innovation was the fact that ladies were going to be employed. This picture is from 1915, and of course, they were running out of men. They were all fighting in the First World War. And they made the decision, the directors of the Underground made this huge decision to employ ladies, and Maida Vale station, and this is where this photo was taken, was run entirely by women. The porters, the ticket collectors, the ticket sellers, they were all ladies. I do have to tell you, though, that it was technically run by a manager, but he was off-site. He was off-site. The ladies were doing it, and they did it really well. But the most interesting thing is that they actually got equal pay long before the Equal Pay Act came into operation. So they thought it was worth it, and they paid the ladies the same as the men. Now, here's another pioneer lady for you. This is Hannah Dadds. She was born in 1941, and in 1978, she qualified as the first woman underground train driver. And here she is getting into the driver's cab in this underground carriage. She never had any accidents. There was never any incident with her driving at all. And she went on driving until she was 60. And she sort of opened the door for women to work on the Underground in doing the jobs that men were doing. They didn't get equal pay, of course, at that time. That came later. But they were doing all the jobs, including driving the trains, as a result of this iconic lady, this woman who made it to be the first underground train driver, Hannah Dadds. Now, I wonder if you've ever wondered what happens at night when the tube gates are locked and nobody is actually running the trains. Well, here you can see that a bit of refurbishment is going on. There are people changing the notice boards. They've put the plastic sheeting over the ticket machines. And as a chap in a high-vis jacket, painter's overalls with a roller on a stick and a big container of paint. So they're doing a little bit of refurbishment, which of course is very, very important, but it's not as important as this. Now, these are ladies. They are here probably in the 1940s or 50s, I would say. And they were known affectionately as fluffers. And their job was at night to come along with their dustpans and brushes and their containers to sweep the underground. Because of course, particles of dust and smoke from years ago, all this is building up in the tube and on the stations, and it needs to be cleared away. Now, there was a development which looked as if it was going to do away with those ladies' jobs, and this was the tunnel cleaning train, known as the Big Yellow Duster. And this worked for several years, trundling around the lines, and it had various pieces of apparatus that sucked up all the nasties from the tubes. But gradually, people began to have anxieties about moving the air in that way, and they suddenly realized the dangers of asbestos. So would you believe it? We are going right back to people with masks on, with dustpans and brushes and buckets, right back to the old fluffers of years ago. Amazing how it works, turns full circle. But the people who were designing Westminster Tube Station didn't really think about the difficulties of cleaning such an incredible installation. Now, if you look about halfway down to the left here, you can see balancing on the big metal tube is a chap who's tied up with ropes, and it's his job to abseil up and down cleaning. And they have a team of cleaners who come in twice a year and spend about 4 weeks cleaning all the surfaces of the Westminster Tube Station. Incredible when you think about it, that problem had to be solved, but in a very simple and practical way. But I think those chaps are jolly brave. And this, of course, is what happens when you don't get the cleaning right. This is the King's Cross disaster, the fire. And this is what it looked like when the flames had come, sucking up from underground and sweeping all before them and killing an awful lot of people. Of course, at that time, smoking was allowed on the underground, and they believed that it was a match that someone had just dropped carelessly on one of the escalators, which in those days were still mostly wood, and it fell through the wooden slats into the collected litter down below, which then, of course, caught fire and caused this dreadful, dreadful accident, as a result of which a lot of changes happened. And here they are. 31 people died, including this wonderful fireman, senior fireman, who was so concerned to save people that he rushed into the inferno without waiting to put on proper apparatus, and he died probably of smoke inhalation. But the inquiry, which happened a year later, made all sorts of recommendations, which mean that we are now much, much safer when we travel on the underground. And they're really quite interesting. So replacing the wooden escalators. smoking banned. This, I think, is very interesting. Radio equipment used by British Transport Police to be compatible with those of the brigade. So you see, what was happening at the night of the fire was the Transport Police were trying to tell the fire brigade what was happening and what to do and help them sort stuff out, but they were on a different frequency. So that was pretty sad. They also looked at the fire brigade's protective equipment. We know we keep hearing about PPE over COVID, but PPE is something that firemen need if they're going into a dangerous situation. Then improve the brigade's radio communication between firefighters below ground. You know, you're in there, you can't see, it's dark, smoke, flames, ghastly. You've got to be able to communicate with your co-workers. And then plans to be kept outside the stations in locations agreed with the brigade, so that the fire brigade responding to a crisis like this know exactly where everything is, because they can access the plans of any station when required. Fantastic. But again, like the Bethnal Green disaster, people had to die before these new ideas were actually implemented. It makes you despair sometimes, doesn't it? But a little bit more cheerful. I wonder how many of us have driven along the Cromwell Road in and out of London on our way to Winchester or from Winchester and seen this rather boring looking building. It is a boring looking building. It's called Ashfield House, but it's got really quite an important thing. This is West Ashfield Station. Now, look to the left. Look at the telephone kiosk. Look at the newsagent stand. They're just pictures. This is where underground personnel are trained. So it's not a real station, but it simulates everything that they need to know about working on the underground. So they can simulate driving a train, they can simulate being on the station platform, managing the travelers and so on. Everything is there simulated for them. Even the air comes out in puffs, as it does when a train comes out of the tube into the station, because of course, as you probably realize, the London Underground, any underground, is self-ventilating. The trains pull the air behind them and push the air in front of them. So that's what keeps the air circulating. And even that is mimicked here at this training station, West Ashfield, which is on one of the upper floors of that boring looking building. Sadly, they're phasing it out in 2024, and I'm not sure what they're going to be replacing it with. But here is another unreal station. I don't know whether any of you are EastEnders fans, but Walford East Station is where all the sort of traveling bits are filmed, and it's actually a film set. Walford Station is not real. It's not even a real one that they've used occasionally. It's a complete mock-up. But I have to say, if it's as dirty inside as it looks outside in this picture, they're going to have problems with keeping it clean and keeping it safe. Now there's a little interlude of fun. I want to show you some of what I think are extremely witty posters that have been created for the London Underground. Bottom right on this one, you can see Easter 1915. And in the picture are all the kids tearing across, and it says, "Why bother about the Germans invading the country? Invade it yourself by underground and motor bus." Really clever, I think. And look at this one. The quickest way to the dogs. Just so witty. This one, the London Zoo. So cleverly incorporating the logo of the circle and bar across, and the word zoo in the tiger's stripes. And this one, oh, I think the taxi drivers who might be using the underground would not be very happy with this one. You either take the tube or you get stuck in a traffic jam in a taxi. And this is almost my favorite. A return trip to the Tower and a single for my wife. Henry VIII, always a laugh a minute. Now, I thought you might enjoy this. I'll try and make it a bit bigger for you. Murder on the Underground. In 1897, on Tuesday evenings in the magazine Today, a series of short stories appeared entitled A Mystery of the Underground, in which a disgruntled, grudge-bearing engineer exacted a bloody revenge on the District Railway Company by murdering innocent passengers travelling on Tuesday nights. The trouble was, the stories were too convincing. Passenger numbers plummeted on Tuesday nights. The MDR complained, and the storyline was switched to a cruise liner heading to Australia, whose tourist board were livid, but the MDR passengers breathed a huge sigh of relief. So you see, a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but the power of the word is still very strong. Now, I wonder if you've ever spent time looking at the outside of your underground station as you whiz along and dive in to get from A to B, or buy your chocolate bar at the kiosk outside. Now, these are some of the early ones by a man called Green, and he used these very memorable sort of oxblood shiny tiles, but they're a very interesting style because that chap Yerkes, the American, who I said made a boo-boo buying all the land up in the north of London to try and build housing estates, which failed. He was very, very innovative in the building of the stations that he could commission. And these stations had a steel frame, which made it possible to build above them. So they weren't single stories. They could have office blocks, residential blocks, all sorts of stuff built above, maximizing the value of the real estate. Now, this is Covent Garden Station, which is normally only accessible by lift. You have to go in a lift to get down, and again in a lift to come out. Of course, there are emergency stairs, but you don't really get to use those. So Covent Garden Station is one of those red ones. And in the wall above it is this advertisement in the terracotta tiles, these lovely shiny red tiles, for Wisden. Now, the Wisden is the Bible of anyone who is interested in cricket. And they had their publishing headquarters here above the station. So number 21, J. Wisden and Company, with the cricket bat and the cricket bats and the ball and the bales and stumps. And it's still there if you look carefully. Now, you heard me do other talks where I've said, don't go around with your eyes shut. It's amazing what you can see if you just look up. And what about this one? Has a spaceship landed in London? No, no, no. This is one of a series of underground stations which were designed by a chap called Charles Holden. Now, Charles Holden did the Senate House in central London behind the British Museum. And of course, the Senate House was what featured as the Ministry of Truth in the film of 1984, very brutalist building. Hitler loved it, and he thought that he would like to have his headquarters there when he had finished invading Britain and after he had sent Nelson's column back to Berlin. But luckily it didn't happen. But Charles Holden was a very modern designer, and he designed several of these wonderfully modern stations on the outskirts of central London. Now, this one, if I were to say to you, where do you think this one is? I think a lot of you who have been widely traveled would want to say the Moscow Underground, because it is very like the kind of thing that those of you who have visited Moscow would see on the Moscow Underground, but it isn't. It's actually Gantz Hill. But I have to tell you that the designers of these very modern stations in the 1950s went to Russia at the invitation of Stalin to advise on the building of the Moscow and Stalingrad undergrounds. So you can see why there is a bit of a visual link here with what you might see in Moscow. And these few slides coming up next, I want to show you how the London Underground is like a chameleon. It's always adapting, adapting, adapting. Now, we're looking here at Whitechapel and Mile End Underground Station. Look really, really careful at the shapes. You've got a little building here, Northumberland House. Then you've got these two arches. Then you've got a little sort of doorway arch. And then there's another archway starting over there. So here it is in the very early days, late 19th century. Here it is in the 1980s. You can see exactly the same. There's that housey building. There are the two archways, now Costa Coffee. There's the little doorway. And that was the beginning of one of these arches, these two arches. So we are now looking at an area of East London with a very large Asian population. So now we see that here it says Whitechapel Station, and here it says Whitechapel Station in Bengali. So that is to honor the large Bengali population of the area, one of the very, very few underground stations which has bilingual signing. And this is Whitechapel Station, the latest of Whitechapel Station, where it's being used for HS2 and Crossrail and the Elizabeth line. Very modern, very spacious, very clean. It looks almost like one of those Japanese stations. And even more innovative, look at this. It's got one of those green roofs, so that to offset its carbon footprint, it has all these plants growing on the roof. Very, very modern. Adapting, adapting, adapting all the time. But I have to just give you one or two words of warning. When you go down and use the underground, you will need to be pretty careful, because the London Underground, especially in the central London areas, has got quite a population of its own mutation of the mosquito. It's been found to be a special mutation, unique to the London Underground. So if you suddenly find yourself scratching, let's hope it's not one of these, although hopefully it won't have bitten anybody who's got malaria first. And there are a lot of other animals involved on the Underground. This picture won a prize in the Evening News in London. A commuter spotted these two mice having a punch up on a deserted platform. But I know, I have to tell you that whenever I went into the Underground, I always got a bit naughty and stood really close to the edge of the platform because I always wanted to look out for mice, dirty little black mice. They are, but I always saw at least one, and apparently there are millions down there. And all sorts of other livestock has been seen, foxes, birds of various kinds, and so on. And there are pigeons who do jump on the train and get off at 2 or 3 stations down and give the commuters the impression they know where they're going. But you'll never be bored on the London Underground, as I say, if you keep your eyes open. And it's quite fun to try and work out why the decorations are as they are. So I'm just going to run past you a few of my favorites. So this is Finsbury Park. Now it's actually a mistake. You've got dueling pistols here because people made the mistake of thinking that this famous dueling area of London was Finsbury Park. It wasn't. It was actually Finsbury Fields, but nevertheless, the dueling pistols are there, as are these. This is also Finsbury Park, and it was Finsbury Fields that Lunardi in I think it was 1768, something like that, did the first manned balloon flight in Britain, and that was from the Finsbury Fields. And around the station platforms are these, there are many wonderful mosaics of these colourful balloons. They are so lovely, and an amazing number of people never notice them. They just get on the train, read their paper, or fiddle with their mobile phones. This one is Stockwell with a beautiful swan, because there was a wonderful ponds at Stockwell years ago. And Tottenham Court Road, of course. And these are the wonderful mosaics by I always want to call him Plazzotto, but no, it's Edoardo Paolozzi. Plazzotto's another Italian-born sculptor. This is Paolozzi, who is very Scottish. I think he's dead now, but he did these wonderful mosaics on Tottenham Court Road tube station of all sorts of just patterns. And this one, of course, is musical instruments and things like that. This is also Tottenham Court Road tube, modern, by a French chap called Buren, Daniel Buren. And Charing Cross, I mean, Charing Cross is just wonderful. You've got the building of the crosses for Eleanor, the Queen of Edward I, who died in near Lincoln. And here you've got more Charing Cross. This is the Douanier Rousseau, the tiger in the jungle in the rain. Here you've got this wonderful installation, copy of a drawing of the Puritan fanatics pulling down the Eleanor Cross, the real Eleanor Cross. The one there now is Charing Cross is a 19th century copy. Baker Street, you go to Baker Street, you've got a big statue of Sherlock Holmes outside, and inside you've got these mosaics or tiles of Sherlock Holmes. I don't think I can get you in far enough, but each one of these tiny dots is actually a minute version of this image of Sherlock Holmes with the deerstalker hat and the pipe. And South Kensington, of course, this is the station that you would go to for the Natural History Museum. And all around the walls here are these wonderful tile designs of animals in the Natural History Museum. Some of them show extinct animals like this dodo and dinosaurs and things, and some of them show extant animals which are there. But I think this has to be my favorite, and I think I'm going to finish my talk here. This is Leytonstone Station, and Leytonstone Station is where the director of these films was born. And here we are, Alfred Hitchcock. So this is the entrance to the station, and it's decorated with these superb mosaics of, here he is directing, but here we've got the birds. This is Psycho, of course. That is Rebecca, and this is North by Northwest. Absolutely fantastic. I really think that is my favorite. And I just leave you with the latest logo, bless her, our Queen, the Elizabeth line. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I haven't gone on for too long because I've not been keeping an eye on the time, but there we are. So can I stop screen sharing?
Yes, please. Wow.
Okay. Right, well, you're probably now suffering from information overload.
I'm totally breathless with all the excitement that I can have just going through one station to another. I mean, you picked your favorite. I mean, first, what has stuck with me is the Bible for the cricketers. That logo, that's one I'm going to, yeah, Wisden. Because my husband was a cricketer, and his name is in the Wisden book. So
really,
something I'll look up to. Never mind.
Oh yes, absolutely. Salute it. Yes,
yes. Wow, I'm absolutely. How shall I say? Impressed, enjoyed. I'm just as if I've taken some elating drug or something. Absolutely. And I mean it, really.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you. Is Amal still recording?
I hope so. Yeah.
Jolly good. Well, you can unmute everybody, Amal, if you want to.
Yes. And you can just, if you put your hands up or if you want to go direct, I don't think we'll mind.
I think they're all just, as I say, gobsmacked.
I agree.
Probably dying for their supper or their glass of gin or something.
I don't think so.
Some of us have got it with us.
Yeah.
Rory, that's naughty.
Absolute Rory for you.
Yeah, brilliant. Yes, to you, Frida, that was an absolutely wonderful talk, as you always do, but one of your best. Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks so many of you for turning up, because you're not all local, are you?
No. We invite everybody. It's an open house, BFWG members, all of them.
Oh, right. Right.
Yeah. I think we like.
Thanks for inviting.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So are we all going to go home now? Shall I say goodbye?
No, let's all give you a nice big clap, really.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Good.
Look forward to
It's
next
a real pleasure. Super, then I'm going.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.